Chapter 15 of Aesthetic as Science of Expression and General Linguistic. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lisa Reichert. Aesthetic as Science of Expression and General Linguistic by Benedetto Croce. Translated by Douglas Ainsley, 1865 to 1948. Chapter 15. The activity of externalization, technique, and the theory of the arts. The practical activity of externalization. The fact of the production of the physically beautiful implies, as has already been remarked, a vigilant will, which persists in not allowing certain visions, intuitions, or representations to be lost. Such a will must be able to act with the utmost rapidity and, as it were, instinctively, and also be capable of long and laborious deliberations. Thus, and only thus, does the practical activity enter into relations with the aesthetic, that is to say, in effecting the production of physical objects which are aids to memory. Here it is not merely a concomitant, but really a distinct moment of the aesthetic activity. We cannot will or not will our aesthetic vision. We can, however, will or not will to externalize it, or better, to preserve and communicate or not to others the externalization produced. The technique of externalization. This volitional fact of externalization is preceded by a complex of various kinds of knowledge. These are known as techniques, like all knowledge which precedes the practical activity. Thus we talk of an artistic technique in the same metaphorical and elliptical manner that we talk of the physically beautiful, that is to say, in more precise language, knowledge employed by the practical activity engaged in producing stimuli to aesthetic reproduction. In place of employing so lengthy a phrase, we shall here avail ourselves of the vulgar terminology, since we are henceforward aware of its true meaning. The possibility of this technical knowledge at the service of artistic reproduction has caused people to imagine the existence of an aesthetic technique of internal expression, which is tantamount to saying a doctrine of the means of internal expression, which is altogether inconceivable. And we know well the reason why it is inconceivable. Expression, considered in itself, is primary theoretic activity, and in so far as it is this, it precedes the practical activity and the intellectual knowledge which illumines the practical activity, and is thus independent alike of the one and of the other. It also helps to illumine the practical activity, but is not illuminated by it. Expression does not employ means, because it has not an end. It has intuitions of things, but does not will them, and is thus indivisible into means and end. Thus, if it be said, as sometimes is the case, that a certain writer has invented a new technique of fiction or of drama, or that a painter has discovered a new mode of distribution of light, the word is used in a false sense, because the so-called new technique is really that romance itself, or that new picture itself. The distribution of light belongs to the vision itself of the picture, as the technique of a dramatist is his dramatic conception itself. On other occasions, the word technique is used to designate certain merits or defects in a work which is a failure, and it is said euphemistically that the conception is bad, but the technique is good, or that the conception is good, and the technique is bad. On the other hand, when the different ways of painting in oils, or of etching, or of sculpturing in alabaster are discussed, then the word technique is in its place. But in such a case the adjective artistic is used metaphorically, and if a dramatic technique in the artistic sense is impossible, a theatrical technique is not impossible, that is to say, process of externalization of certain given aesthetic works. When, for instance, women were introduced on the stage in Italy in the second half of the 16th century, in place of men dressed as women, this was a true and real discovery in theatrical technique. Such, too, was the perfecting in the following century, by the impresarios of Venice, of machines for the rapid changing of the scenes. The theoretic techniques of the individual arts. The collection of technical knowledge at the service of artists, desirous of externalizing their expressions, can be divided into groups, which may be entitled theories of the arts. Thus is born a theory of architecture, comprising mechanical laws, information relating to the weight or to the resistance of the materials of construction or of fortification, manuals relating to the method of mixing chalk or stucco, a theory of sculpture containing advice as to the instruments to be used for sculpturing the various sorts of stone, for obtaining a successful fusion of bronze, for working with the chisel, for the exact copying of the model in chalk or plaster, for keeping chalk damp. A theory of painting, on the various techniques of tempera, of oil painting, of watercolor, of pastel, on the proportions of the human body, on the laws of perspective. A theory of oratory, with precepts as to the method of producing, of exercising, and of strengthening the voice, of mimic and gesture, a theory of music on the combinations and fusions of tones and sounds, and so on. Such collections of precepts abound in all literatures, and since it soon becomes impossible to say what is useful and what useless to know, books of this sort become very often a sort of encyclopedias or catalogues of desiderata. Vitruvius, in his treatise on architecture, claims for the architect a knowledge of letters, of drawing, of geometry, of arithmetic, of optic, of history, of natural and moral philosophy, of jurisprudence, of medicine, of astrology, of music, and so on. Everything is worth knowing. Learn the art and lay it aside. It should be evident that such empirical collections are not reducible to a science. They are composed of notions, taken from various sciences and teachings, and their philosophical and scientific principles are to be found in them. To undertake the construction of a scientific theory of the different arts would be to wish to reduce to the single and homogeneous what is by nature multiple and heterogeneous. To wish to destroy the existence as a collection of what was put together precisely to form a collection. Were we to give a scientific form to the manuals of the architect, the painter, or the musician, it is clear that nothing would remain in our hands but the general principles of mechanic, optic, or acoustic, or if the especially artistic observations disseminated through it be extracted and isolated, and a science be made of them, then the sphere of the individual art is deserted, and that of aesthetic entered upon, for aesthetic is always general aesthetic, or better, it cannot be divided into general and special. This last case, that is the attempt to furnish a technique of aesthetic, is found when men possessing strong scientific instincts and a natural tendency to philosophy set themselves to work to produce such theories and technical manuals. Critique of the aesthetic theories of the individual arts. But the confusion between physic and aesthetic has attained to its highest degree when aesthetic theories of the different arts are imagined to answer such questions as: what are the limits of each art? What can be represented with colours, and what with sounds? What with simple monochromatic lines, and what with touches of various colours? What with notes, and what with meters and rhymes? What are the limits between the figurative and the auditional arts? Between painting and sculpture, poetry and music? This, translated into scientific language, is tantamount to asking: what is the connection between acoustic and aesthetic expression? What between the latter and optic? And the like. Now, if there is no passage from the physical fact to the aesthetic, how could there be from the aesthetic to particular groups of aesthetic facts, such as the phenomena of optic or of acoustic? Critique of the classifications of the arts. The things called arts have no aesthetic limits, because, in order to have them, they would need to have also aesthetic existence, and we have demonstrated the altogether empirical genesis of those divisions. Consequently, any attempt at an aesthetic classification of the arts is absurd. If they be without limits, they are not exactly determinable, and consequently cannot be philosophically classified. All the books dealing with classifications and systems of the arts could be burned without any loss whatever. We say this with the utmost respect to the writers who have expended their labours upon them. The impossibility of such classifications finds, as it were, its proof in the strange methods to which recourse has been had to carry them out. The first and most common classification is that into arts of hearing, sight, and imagination, as if eyes, ears, and imagination were on the same level, and could be deduced from the same logical variable as foundation of the division. Others have proposed the division into arts of space and time, and arts of rest and motion, as if the concepts of space, time, rest, and motion could determine special aesthetic forms, or have anything in common with art as such. Finally, others have amused themselves by dividing them into classic and romantic, or into oriental, classic, and romantic, thereby conferring the value of scientific concepts on simple historical denominations, or adopting those pretended partitions of expressive forms already criticized above, or by talking of arts that can only be seen from one side, like painting, and of arts that can be seen from all sides, like sculpture, and similar extravagances which exist neither in heaven nor on the earth. The theory of the limits of the arts was, perhaps, at the time when it was put forward, a beneficial critical reaction against those who believed in the possibility of the flowing of one expression into another, as of the Iliad, or of Paradise Lost, into a series of paintings, and thus held a poem to be of greater or lesser value, according as it could or could not be translated into pictures by a painter. But if the rebellion were reasonable and victorious, this does not mean that the arguments adopted and the theories made as required were sound. Critique of the theory of the union of the arts. Another theory, which is a corollary to that of the limits of the arts, falls with them, that of the union of the arts. Granted different arts, distinct and limited, the questions were asked, what is the most powerful? Do we not obtain more powerful effects by uniting several? We know nothing of this. We know only, in each individual case, that certain given artistic intuitions have need of definite physical means for their reproduction, and that other artistic intuitions have need of other physical means. We can obtain the effect of certain dramas by simply reading them. Others need declamation and scenic display. Some artistic intuitions, for their full extrinsication, need words, song, musical instruments, colours, statuary, architecture, actors, while others are beautiful and complete in a single delicate sweep of the pen, or with a few strokes of the pencil. But it is false to suppose that declamation and scenic effects, and all the other things we have mentioned together, are more powerful than simply reading, or than the simple stroke with the pen and with the pencil. Because each of these facts or groups of facts has, so to say, a different object, and the power of the different means employed cannot be compared when the objects are different. Connection of the activity of externalization with utility and morality. Finally, it is only from the point of view of a clear and rigorous distinction between the true and proper aesthetic activity and the practical activity of externalization that we can solve the involved and confused questions as to the relations between art and utility, and art and morality. That art as art is independent alike of utility and of morality, as also of every volitional form, we have above demonstrated. Without this independence, it would not be possible to speak of an intrinsic value of art, nor indeed to conceive an aesthetic science, which demands the autonomy of the aesthetic fact as a necessity of its existence. But it would be erroneous to maintain that this independence of the vision or intuition or internal expression of the artist should be at once extended to the practical activity of externalization and of communication, which may or may not follow the aesthetic fact. If art be understood as the externalization of art, then utility and morality have a perfect right to deal with it, that is to say, the right one possesses to deal with one's own household. We do not, as a matter of fact, externalize and fix all of the many expressions and intuitions which we form in our mind. We do not declare our every thought in a loud voice, or write down, or print, or draw, or colour, or expose it to the public gaze. We select from the crowd of intuitions which are formed, or at least sketched within us, and the selection is governed by selection of the economic conditions of life and of its moral direction. Therefore, when we have formed an intuition, it remains to decide whether or no we should communicate it to others, and to whom, and when, and how, all of which considerations fall equally under the utilitarian and ethical criterion. Thus we find the concepts of selection, of the interesting, of morality, of an educational end, of popularity, etc., to some extent justified, although these can in no wise be justified as imposed upon art as art, and we have ourselves denounced them in pure aesthetic. Error always contains an element of truth. He who formulated those erroneous aesthetic propositions had his eye on practical facts, which attach themselves externally to the aesthetic fact in economic and moral life. By all means, be partisans of a yet greater liberty in the vulgarization of the means of aesthetic reproduction. We are of the same opinion, and let us leave the proposals for legislative measures, and for actions to be instigated against immoral art, to hypocrites, to the ingenuous, and to idlers. But the proclamation of this liberty, and the fixation of its limits, how wide soever they be, is always the affair of morality, and it would in any case be out of place to invoke that highest principle, that fundamentum aestheticis, which is the independence of art, in order to deduce from it the guiltlessness of the artist, who in the externalization of his imaginings should calculate upon the unhealthy tastes of his readers, or that licenses should be granted to the hawkers who sell obscene statuettes in the streets. This last case is the affair of the police. The first must be brought before the tribunal of the moral conscience. The aesthetic judgment on the work of art has nothing to do with the morality of the artist, in so far as he is a practical man, nor with the precautions to be taken that art may not be employed for evil purposes alien to its essence, which is pure theoretic contemplation. End of chapter 15. Recording by Lisa Reichert.